بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. قد قال الله تعالى في كتابه العزيز بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما صلى الله عليه وسلم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So inshallah today, still covering the Seerah An-Nabawiyyah, alhamdulillah, which is the beautiful story of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and why he has deserved the highest station. His story brings nothing but love in the heart of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Jazakallah khair, habibi. It brings nothing but love to Allah for giving us a messenger like Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we're now in the 5th year of prophethood, 5th year of nubuwah. And there's been a lot of oppression that has been going on against the Muslims. They tried to bribe the Prophet Muhammad with money and material wealth. It didn't work. They tried to get his uncle Abu Talib to give him up and replace him with another child. It was a very interesting, bizarre proposition by the Quraysh. That didn't work. He basically told him, get out of my face. Long story short, that's what happened. And then they did physical acts of aggression against the companions. They killed Ali Yasir radiallahu anhu and Sumayya radiallahu anha, and Ammar almost was killed too until he was able to finally be freed from the oppression and escape the oppression. People like Uthman ibn Affan were tied up. Bilal radiallahu anhu dragged in the streets. Many slaves were persecuted. Many women were tortured. And so when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ realized that there is nothing that he can do in this moment to help his companions the way that he wants to, in the 5th year of Nubuwah, it is the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ who read a reminder to the companions when he read the story of Surah Al-Kahf and the people of the cave, where there was a group of people that came before you. There was a group of people that were tortured, that were persecuted, that were forced to migrate. And so those of you who wish to migrate, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ told them that there is a king. His name is Najashi, and he lives in a land called Abyssinia, which is the modern day East African region. And he is a just king. He is a Christian king and he is a just king. And no one is oppressed in his presence. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he said, وَالَّذِينَ هَاجَرُوا فِي اللَّهِ مِن بَعْدِ مَا ظُلِمُوا لَنُبَوِّئَنَّهُمْ فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَالْأَجْرُ الْآخِرَةِ أَكْبَرُ لَوْ كَانُوا يَعْلَمُونَ. And as for those who immigrate for the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala after suffering oppression, we will certainly give them good residence in this world, but indeed the reward of the hereafter will be greater if they only knew. And in regard to meaning of this verse, Al-Qurtubi rahimahullah, he said that Qatada said, those who are intended here are the companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The mushrikun have wronged them in Mecca and forced them to leave. And so a party of them reached Abyssinia, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provided them with the land of migration, Al-Madinah, and with helpers, the Ansar from among the believers. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also revealed Surah Al-Zumar, verse in Surah Al-Zumar, قُلْ يَا عِبَادِ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَاتَّقُوا قُلْ يَا عِبَادِ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اتَّقُوا رَبَّكُمْ لِلَّذِينَ أَحْسَنُوا فِي هَذِهِ الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَأَرْضُ اللَّهِ وَاسِعَةٌ إِنَّمَا يُوَفَّى الصَّابِرُونَ أَجْرُهُمْ بِغَيْرِ حِسَابٍ. Say, O Prophet, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, my servants who believe, be mindful of your Lord. Those who do good in this world will have a good reward. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's earth is spacious, and only those who endure patiently will be given the reward without limit. Now, one thing this shows us is that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was an extremely empathetic leader. By this point in time, there are about 100 believers. So the Muslims are growing in number. And it's giving them strength, it's giving them community, and there's solidarity that is happening amongst the Muslims. Now, in spite of that, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam always put the well-being and security of the Muslims first. That their safety was more important to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ than having large numbers and large community of Muslims. The Prophet understood that as a leader, it was his ﷺ job to be well informed, to be well researched about what was going on in the lands around him and what were the options that were available to him. Right? So not only is the Prophet ﷺ a master when it comes to being a prophet, but everything that is required for leadership, he's a master at. Whether it's to be the general, whether it's to be the geopolitician, or the judge, or the teacher, or the father, whatever role the Prophet ﷺ took in his life, he always was the best in that role. So now he's currently taking like a geopolitical role, understanding what the different lands around him are engaging in so that he can figure out the best options that are available to him and to his ummah. So he found out that there was a king, a Christian king of Abyssinia, Habasha region, by the name of An-Najm. And he was well known for his religious tolerance. That there were many minority religious communities in An-Najm's kingdom. So there were Jews that were living there, there were even Majus that were living there, the fire worshippers, there were mushrikun, idol worshippers that were living there. So in this month of Rajab, in the 5th year of prophethood, the Prophet gathered some of his believers together and proposed that those who need to migrate should explore that opportunity, should look at that opportunity to be amongst Najashi's kingdom, where they won't be persecuted for their religion, and to leave for Abyssinia. So this happened in the month of Rajab, which, subhanAllah, we're actually in the month of Rajab right now. I believe it's the 10th of Rajab right now. And the first group of people who migrated to Abyssinia comprised of about 15 to 16 people, right? And there were 4 women who were wives of 4 of the men in that group, and the rest were single men. So, names of the companions who were migrating to Abyssinia. There's Uthman ibn Affan and his wife, Ruqayya bint Muhammad. Right? Uthman ibn Affan is the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and his wife, Ruqayya bint Muhammad, is the second daughter of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. They were kind of appointed as the leader of the group to make sure that everybody gets to Abyssinia safely. There's Abu Hudayfa bin Utbah and his wife Sahla bin Suhail, Zubair ibn al-Awwam, Mus'ab ibn Umair, Abdurrahman ibn Auf, Abu Salama and his wife Salama. Abu Salama is going to later pass away, and so Salama is going to later become the wife of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Uthman ibn Mad'un is one of those who went. Amr ibn Rabi' and his wife Layla bint Abu Hathma, they also went. Abu Sabra also went. And the one that is kind of disputed on like the last one of the companions that went was it Hatim ibn Amr or was it Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who was the last of the companions to go to Abyssinia with this first group. And more likely it's Hatim ibn Amr, because more authentic narrations say that Abdullah ibn Mas'ud went to the second wave of those who will travel to Abyssinia. So the group will leave at night. And there was not enough transportation for all of them. So they were about 15 to 16 people, and they had about 7 to 8 animals for rides with them. And so they had to take turns riding the animals. And so when the morning time came and people realized that they were gone, the Quraysh put together a search party to look for them. The Quraysh, they wanted to drag the refugees back to Mecca to keep them under their torture. To keep them under their torture. They say, we are going to oppress you, but we don't want anybody to know about our oppression. The oppression is good, as long as nobody else knows about it. So we'll kill as many journalists as we need to cover up for our oppression. But as long as we can contain the oppression, we will do that. So the search party of the Quraysh was to protect their own ego and also the facade that they put up with the rest of the Arab world, that there is some just, righteous group of people, which has been completely broken under the pressure of the Muslims And they were able to see the hypocrisy straight through it. Or all of us can see the hypocrisy straight through it. So the Muslim migrants, they reached a port to sell to Abyssinia. And they had very limited funds. Very limited. They say that it was about half a dinar, half of a gold coin, which if you, today you look at it, it's probably about a couple $100. And so they paid an Abyssinian man to take them for $100 and limited food rations, all 15 and 16 of them, and sail in this small boat, like a rental boat with a crew, and sell them to Eastern Africa. And he did. Alhamdulillah. He took the money and he took them, the Muslims, to Abyssinia. By the time the search party from the Quraysh reached the port, the Muslims had already departed. And so the Prophet ﷺ, obviously, he's very worried about his companions. And he was curious about what happened to the Muslim migrants. So the Prophet ﷺ would wait in the shops of Medina, in the businesses of Medina, or Mecca, where people would do business and trade in Mecca, because it was very common that people would come from Abyssinia to Mecca to engage in trade. So one day he heard someone coming from Abyssinia, and this man was probably a trader or a businessman. And the Prophet ﷺ searched out for that man and asked him, have you heard or come across anybody that was leaving Mecca and going towards Habasha? And he said, yes, actually I heard of some people. Before I was able to take leave from Habasha, I saw that there was a few Arabs that came, and I had time to speak with them a little bit. And so yes, I heard about some people. Prophet ﷺ said, how are they doing? And he said, as far as I know, they've reached their destination safely. But that's the last I've heard of them. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he was relieved. Because in this moment, he's not only speaking as a leader of his community, but he's also speaking as a father. His daughter is with this group. His son-in-law is with this group. So he was able to see these people, speak with them. He said, yes, I spoke to them for a few moments. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said, have you seen a couple? Have you seen a couple? They are like the leaders of the group. They're hard to miss. And he was speaking of Uthman and Ruqayya, radiallahu anhum. And this man, listen to this man, what he says. It's beautiful. He says, I saw those two. وقد رأيت حمل عثمان امرأته على حمار فقال إن عثمان أول من هاجر بأهله بعد لوط. So, this Abyssinian man, he tells the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, not only did I see those two, that husband and wife, but the husband, Uthman, put his wife on top of a mule, and the husband was leading the mule, and it was a very slow and weak animal. Allah. Beautiful. One thing about Uthman ibn Affan is he was a man of integrity, he was a man of haya, he was a man to be trustworthy. And he's even narrated, Prophet ﷺ talks about him, that even before Islam, he was a just, righteous man, never committed zina, never drank alcohol, never engaged in the evil actions that his society would engage in. Very righteous man. And here he is, serving his wife, not using the animal for himself, rather leading the animal and having his wife ride the animal instead, so that she is comfortable, she can rest, she can stay off her feet, and he can remain on his feet. And he will be the one that will take that burden. And that's what a man does. That's what a husband is supposed to do. You are supposed to take the sacrifices on behalf of your family. That is masculinity, right? Nowadays we'll look at this, and unfortunately so many will say, what a simp. They'll call him a simp. But by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Uthman ibn Affan, you take him and you put him on one side of the scale, and every man that exists today, and you put him on the other side of the scale, his masculinity will outweigh all of them. Because Sayyidul Qawm khadimhu. The Prophet ﷺ said that the best of people, the best of leaders, the one who leads the people is the one that serves them. Is the one that serves them. And there is probably no companion that is better in terms of service than Uthman ibn Affan. Uthman ibn Affan, the amount of service that he provided for this deen is incredible. So much so that there still is an endowment that was established by Uthman ibn Affan. Till this day, it's still running. And it's being used to build hospitals, it's being used to feed the poor, so you can't even imagine how much ajr, reward Uthman ibn Affan is receiving for his service. Amazing individual, amazing human being, and a lot we can learn from him. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he was relieved when he heard this news, and he said, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be with them. And then the Prophet ﷺ, he said that Inna Uthman أول من هاجر بأهله بعد لوط. Uthman ibn Affan, he has revived a great tradition of the prophets of the past. This Uthman ibn Affan is the first one to leave his home with his family for the sake of his iman since Lut alayhi salam. Lut alayhi salam. And so what's beautiful about this specifically, the Prophet ﷺ saying this, it's almost like, وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيُ يُوحَى. The Prophet ﷺ does not speak anything from his desires. It's all revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we even say that the speech of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is, it has that weight. Right? So that's why that we have the Quran and the Sunnah. The words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not his desires, it's being inspired by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So everything the Prophet ﷺ said, it's almost like he was saying it for a purpose. And it's not almost, it is, right? Obviously. He's saying it exactly for a purpose. As if he knew that maybe later on, people are going to try to use this against Uthman ibn Affan, and that's exactly what happened. And so this right here dispels the notion that these Muslims who chose to leave Mecca are weaker than the Muslims who stayed behind. Because we might think that way. In our limited, weird, dunya, material way, we say, oh, these people ran away from the struggle and these people decided to stay. The people that decided to stay are stronger than the ones that left. And so the Prophet, he compliments Uthman by putting him in the same rank in his terms of his words, not his station, but in terms of the same rank as Lut alayhi salam, a prophet of Allah, to show that these migrants, these Muslim migrants, are just as noble as the ones that stayed behind in Mecca. And so when some of the Khawarij, they seized Medina during the Khilafah of Uthman, radiallahu an. So he's the third Khalifa. Right? Abu Bakr Siddiq, then Umar ibn Khattab, then Uthman radiallahu an. They assassinated Uthman while he was reading the Quran. They surrounded his tent. And they started making accusations against him. One of the accusations that they said was Uthman was a coward that ran away from Mecca when he migrated to Abyssinia. They were trying to discredit Uthman and make him to be a coward. But the Prophet ﷺ already addressed it. He already addressed it. He spoke of the virtue of these migrants to Abyssinia. And he made dua for those migrants. So the Prophet ﷺ, and what's also beautiful about that as well is that during that time when Uthman ibn Affan was in his home and he was being surrounded by the Khawarij and to be assassinated, many of the companions told Uthman ibn Affan, just give us the command, and we will fight against these Khawarij. We got the numbers. Ali radiallahu anh was in the mix. No one can defeat Ali radiallahu anh. It can be 1 against 100. Ali will win every time. So I was like, well, just give us the command. We'll go through it. We'll do it. And the Khawarij, were, they claimed to be Muslim, but they had a lot of actions and a lot of, extreme views that caused them to, uprise against the companions and cause a lot of fitna, and there's a whole history behind it. I'm not going to try to go into that tangent, but the Khawarij essentially were people that were claiming to be Muslim. They were claiming to be Muslim. They're misguided people. And so Uthman ibn Affan, he refused to fight back against them because he said at this point, so far in this point in the Khilafah, there has not been a single Muslim that has shed blood against another Muslim. And so he said that I will not be the first person to start that sunnah. Even if they're not acting the way they're supposed to be acting, they claim to be Muslim, I will treat them as such. Again, I don't know any man braver than Uthman ibn Affan today. Right? So, mashallah, we can learn a lot from this individual. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he told the Muslims when they get to Abyssinia, lay low, right? Just keep quiet. Don't cause a lot of problems. Don't cause any problems. And so they lived outside of a major city in Habasha. And this was so, multiple reasons. There are a lot of wisdoms to this, but this was so that the men could go to work, they can buy and sell in the major city, but they lived outside of that city so that the migrants won't be a point of curiosity or contention from that particular community. And also, when the search party comes for the Muslims, it will be hard to catch them. And so when the search party from the Quraysh failed to find the Muslims who had escaped Mecca, the Quraysh decided to put a tighter clamp on the remaining Muslims in Mecca. Now the Quraysh kept a very strict eye on who exactly the Muslims were. They did not allow any of those Muslims to exit Mecca. They set up borders. They set up a patrol and tracked the Muslims in Mecca. Because the fear is what? The fear is that if the Muslims migrate away from the city where we cannot keep an eye on them and oppress them, they will grow in number, they will grow in strength, and then they will come back and exact their revenge. Because they project. Oppressors like to project. So they say that if we don't do this, then they would do it to us. And if you look at history, that is history summarized right there. Every oppressor says that if we don't oppress the people that we are oppressing, they will uprise again, they will genocide us instead. So exactly what the Quraysh are doing as well. So they had this border patrol, spies, security, everything. And so the Muslims in Mecca were facing heavy persecution. And 2 months after the first group of Muslims left Mecca, there is a major incident that occurs. It was the month of Ramadan. And although the obligations of Ramadan have not yet been sent down, because that will come in Medina, there is a very special association with the month of Ramadan even before the fasting that was prescribed. Does anybody know what that is? What's the special correlation with Ramadan that the Muslims had even before fasting? Sorry, what you got it? The month of the Quran. شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن. Right? Are you guys awake? You guys alive? Okay, alhamdulillah. This is the month in which the Quran was sent down. So Iqra, according to the majority of scholars, the first revelation, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, it was revealed during the month of Ramadan. So therefore, the Muslims have a very close affinity with the month of Ramadan, even before fasting. And so the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he went to the Haram as part of his normal routine at the Baytullah to pray. And obviously, nobody likes it, right? But they tolerate it because the Prophet ﷺ has protection from Abu Talib and Banu Hashim. And so as the Prophet ﷺ was praying in the Haram, usually he would recite loud enough for himself to hear, and maybe anybody in his immediate vicinity would hear. But for this reason, maybe it was the inspiration of his beloved companion Abdullah ibn Mas'ud reciting Surah Ar-Rahman publicly. Maybe it was just sudden inspiration that he received himself. He decided he's going to recite loudly. So the Prophet ﷺ, he begins to recite this Quran very loud, a particular surah. And as the Prophet ﷺ continues to recite the Quran out loud, the people that are there become agitated. Now this guy has gone too far. He comes here, he does his thing, we put up with it so much, but now he's going to make us listen to it. This is too much. So they get close to the Prophet ﷺ to sort him out. And as soon as they get close enough to hear him, they stop dead in their tracks to listen to the Prophet ﷺ's words. And the Prophet then raised his voice, and now everyone at the Haram is listening, and they all become quiet and stopped exactly what they were doing. They all took a moment to listen to Rasulullah ﷺ's words, and they were completely captivated. The Quraysh listened to the Prophet ﷺ reciting from what? What surah? Surah An-Najm. Right? A very powerful surah that was revealed. A surah that will create an incident amongst the Quraysh that will amaze everybody. And before we get to that, in order for us to understand, I'm going to call Hafid Abdul Samad to come up here. I'm going to have a guest speaker today. Not speaker, but Qari. So Qari Abdul Samad, if you can hear me through the microphone, you're being called to the stage. You're being called to the principal's office. in order to feel the power of the surah, to understand why I'm even doing this, is because the surah is so powerful, or why even the events that happened during the surah occurred. We have to appreciate it. So in a moment, Qari Abdul Samad is going to actually recite the entire surah for us, Surah An-Najm. Your guys' job is to pull up a translation of it, right? On your phone, on your laptop. There's some English translations floating around here somewhere. You can grab one of the books, and we will recite Surah An-Najm. Just while he's reciting, read the translation and reflect on the words. Okay? If we did a tafsir of Surah An-Najm, we'd be here for 17 years. It's a very deep, powerful surah. But we will just cover the translation, inshallah. And then afterwards, we will talk a little bit about the incident that occurred afterwards. At the end of the surah, you will notice there is a sajda tilawa, meaning a prostration of recitation. So at the last verse, we're all together going to face the qibla, do the sajda tilawa. So you'll just go into sajda as you normally do in salah. You'll say Subhana Rabbil A'la 3 times or more. And then we'll come back up and then we'll start discussing. Okay? Everybody clear? Everybody good? If you are able to do sajda tilawa, go ahead and do it, inshallah. If you are unable, then do it in your heart, inshallah ta'ala. Jazakumullah khair. Now I'll pass off the mic to Qari Abdul Samad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والنجم إذا هوى ما ضل صاحبكم وما طغى ما ضل صاحبكم وما غوى وما ينطق عن الهوى إن هو إلا وحي يوحى علمه شديد القوى ذو مرة فاستوى وهو بالأفق الأعلى ثم دنا فتدلى فكان قاب قوسين أو أدنى فأوحى إلى عبده ما أوحى ما كذب الفؤاد ما رأى أفتمارونه على ما يرى ولقد رآه نزلة أخرى عند سدرة المنتهى عندها جنة المأوى إذ يغشى السدرة ما يغشى ما زاغ البصر وما طغى لقد رأى من آيات ربه الكبرى أفرأيتم اللات والعزى ومناة الثالثة الأخرى ألكم الذكر وله الأنثى تلك إذا قسمة ضيزى إن هي إلا أسماء سميتموها أنتم وآباؤكم ما أنزل الله بها من سلطان إن يتبعون إلا الظن وما تهوى الأنفس ولقد جاءهم من ربهم الهدى أم للإنسان ما تمنى فلله الآخرة والأولى وكم من ملك في السماوات لا تغني شفاعتهم شيئا إلا من بعد أن يأذن الله لمن يشاء ويرضى إن الذين لا يؤمنون بالآخرة ليسمون الملائكة تسمية الأنثى وما لهم به من علم إن يتبعون إلا الظن وإن الظن لا يغني من الحق شيئا فأعرض عمن تولى عن ذكرنا ولم يرد إلا الحياة الدنيا ذلك مبلغهم من العلم إن ربك هو أعلم بمن ضل عن سبيله وهو أعلم بمن اهتدى ولله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض ليجزي الذين أساءوا بما عملوا ويجزي الذين أحسنوا بالحسنى الذين يجتنبون كبائر الإثم والفواحش إلا اللمم إن ربك واسع المغفرة هو أعلم بكم إذ أنشأكم من الأرض وإذ أنتم أجنة في بطون أمهاتكم فلا تزكوا أنفسكم هو أعلم بمن اتقى أفرأيت الذي تولى وأعطى قليلا وأكدى أعنده علم الغيب فهو يرى أم لم ينبأ بما في صحف موسى وإبراهيم الذي وفى ألا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى وأن ليس للإنسان إلا ما سعى وأن سعيه سوف يرى ثم يجزاه الجزاء الأوفى وأن إلى ربك المنتهى وأنه هو أضحك وأبكى وأنه هو أمات وأحيا وأنه خلق الزوجين الذكر والأنثى من نطفة إذا تمنى وأن عليه النشأة الأخرى وأنه هو أغنى وأقنى وأنه هو رب الشعرى وأنه أهلك عادا الأولى وثمود فما أبقى وقوم نوح من قبل إنهم كانوا هم أظلم وأطغى والمؤتفكة أهوى فغشاها ما غشا فبأي آلاء ربك تتمارى هذا نذير من النذر الأولى أزفت الآزفة ليس لها من دون الله كاشفة أفمن هذا الحديث تعجبون وتضحكون ولا تبكون وأنتم سامدون فاسجدوا لله واعبدوا.
So after the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ recited those verses, as beautifully as Qari Abdul Samad just recited, and beautiful it was, mashallah, tabarakallah. One thing all of us, inshallah, desire is that there's going to come a day where we're going to hear those words recited from Rasulullah's mouth directly. And what a special day that's going to be. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept us into paradise. Ameen. The Prophet ﷺ, he fell into sajda. And instinctively, everyone who was in the haram, the majority had not even accepted Islam yet. So there's mushrikun, there's people who are on the brink, all of them, without fail, fell into sajda. Abu Jahl was there, fell into sajda. The Fir'aun of this ummah fell into sajda. Walid bin Mughira, or some scholars say it was actually Umayyah bin Khalaf. Walid bin Mughira, it's probably Umayyah bin Khalaf because there's an authentic narration in Bukhari, so it's more likely it is actually Umayyah bin Khalaf. But Utbah ibn Rabi'a was there, and Walid bin Mughira was there. And if you remember from last week, they're the ones that had that interaction with the Prophet ﷺ. Utbah bin Rabi'a had that interaction where the Prophet ﷺ responded to him by reciting the verses of Surah Fussilat. Do you guys remember that incident we talked about last week? That's Utbah bin Rabi'a. He fell into sajda. Walid bin Mughira had a similar interaction with the Prophet ﷺ, also fell into sajda. Umayyah bin Khalaf, he wanted to be different, right? He's like, you know what? I want to fall into sajda, but I'm not going to do what Muhammad does. So even so, he felt compelled to do something. After hearing those verses, he picked up some dirt and he put it on his forehead. Ajib. Astonishing, wallahi. Very interesting. So there was a moment, and I want us to remember something that I talked about very early when we were talking about the introduction of the Seerah class, which is what? These people of Quraysh, there's a common misunderstanding that they didn't believe in Allah at all. That's not true. They did actually believe in Allah. They knew who Allah was because they had the legacy of Ibrahim alayhi salam still in their midst. But what they started doing is associating partners with Allah, giving Allah's powers to other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this was a problem. So they believe Allah. And we've seen other stories in the Seerah already where there are so many people of Quraysh, even the leaders, that are saying like, we know these words are not from this earth, but they can't give up the dunya. They just can't give up what they're doing. So they know this, right? We'll talk about later on in the Seerah, closer to the hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ to Medina, where there was multiple nights where the leaders of Quraysh caught each other standing outside the house of the Prophet ﷺ at night, and they were just sitting there listening to the Quran, and then they made eye contact with each other. They see each other because it was dark. It's pitch dark. There's no light. It's not like like we have today, street lamps and things like that. It's pitch dark, and so they're sitting there at night all the way till the morning, just listening to the Prophet ﷺ recite Quran in his home. And then they see each other in the morning and they make eye contact. They're like, oh, this is awkward. And they run away. 3 nights in a row this happened until one day they had to be like, all right, we gotta talk about this. I saw you, you saw me. You know that Spider-Man meme? So like, they know it's true. So when they heard these verses, they couldn't do anything but fall into prostration. They couldn't do anything. And the Prophet ﷺ, he gets up, everybody gets up, and there's an awkward silence. And the Prophet ﷺ, he just lets them sit in that awkward silence for a moment. Doesn't say anything. Because the fitrah is now talking. There's no words that need to be said. And so after a while, no words were said by the Prophet. No words. People dispersed. Now, later, the leaders of Quraysh, they gathered for some PR conference. And they were like, okay, the truth is coming out. The world saw it. The world knows that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his companions are the ones that are on guidance and we're the ones that are misguided. So now we have to come up with a master PR strategy. So what did they say? They said they claimed that the Prophet ﷺ was reciting sorcery, which took physical control over our bodies and over the Quraysh's bodies and made everyone fall into sujood. Right? And so they go publicly and they say, everybody that fell into sajda and you didn't want to, don't worry, this is all just part of Muhammad's sorcery. And so, however, this incident doesn't fall under the radar. Word spreads. The truth spreads. Because you can extinguish the light of Allah as much as you want, or try to extinguish light of Allah, desire to extinguish light of Allah as much as you want, but Allah will always let it shine. And so it started to spread outside of Mecca, that basically all of Quraysh accepted Muhammad's religion. That was the narrative. That was given, that was spreading. That was a rumor that was spreading. Not quite true, but that was the narrative that was being spread. And so these rumors, they reach Abyssinia that the Quraysh had accepted Islam. So the Muslim migrants, they begin to think, it's time to go back home. Finally, it's time to go back home. And they were there for about 4 months-ish. So they went there in Rajab, then there was Sha'ban, then there was Ramadan, and then by the time the news had reached them that this incident had occurred, then there was Shawwal. Then they came back. And while they were in Abyssinia, whenever people would come that might have news about Mecca, they would always ask about Mecca. What's going on in Mecca? What's going on in Mecca? So out of the 16 original migrants, 12 of them head back for Mecca. And they met a Qurayshi man just outside of Mecca, and the Qurayshi said to the group of Muslims, yo, aren't you guys the ones that left, right? Welcome back. The migrants said, yeah, there was a lot of persecution. We had to leave. But now that all the Quraysh has accepted Islam, we've decided to come back. And the guy's like, it's not what happened. Not really what happened. And Quraysh said, well, all of them became Muslim, right? That's what we heard. He said, no, that's not what happened. And then they told him the story about the sajda. That, yeah, everybody prostrated, but, we ended up finding out, because we believe CNN and Fox News, that it was actually just sorcery the whole time, right? So now they're heartbroken. The Muslims are heartbroken. What do we do now? Do we stay or leave? A couple of them decide to go back and stay there, but 10 of the migrants that went back from Abyssinia to Mecca, they decided to stay in Mecca, and we'll just toughen it out, right? We don't want to leave our families again. So when the Prophet ﷺ asked them, he asked them, why are they here? And he told them about the rumors that they heard. But now, the Muslims in Mecca, they learn that Abyssinia is perfectly safe for the Muslims to worship freely without any fear of persecution. They were living it up for 4 months, right? They had a great time. And the torture of Muslims in Mecca, they started to intensify day by day with no signs of stopping. So the migration to Abyssinia becomes the favorable option for these Muslims. And in the next few weeks, dozens of Muslims began to leave Mecca in waves, small groups, 4 or 5 people, because of the border patrol in Mecca. So essentially what they would do is they basically get permission to kind of leave Mecca. Oh, we're just going for some business, we'll come back. We're going to graze our animals and we'll come back, and they just did, right? So this happened in waves. And about 80 or some odd people leave Mecca for Abyssinia until a small community of Muslims began to emerge in Abyssinia. And so there was about 82 to 83 Muslim men and about 16 Muslim women. And they consisted of both elite and former slaves. And it was a very diverse group of people. Towards the end of the 5th year of Nubuwah and approaching the 6th year of Nubuwah, there is about 100 Muslims in Abyssinia. And the Quraysh start to realize that Mecca is emptying out from Muslims. And the Quraysh are concerned because now the Muslims are setting up camp. They're safe. They're somewhere where they can preach their message freely. There's somewhere where they can, practice justice, practice mercy. There's somewhere where we can't hurt them. And we can't let that happen. We got to crash this Muslim party that is going on in Abyssinia. When it comes to the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, some lessons we can take away from this whole Abyssinia incident is that a responsible leader has to be well-researched and well-informed. You have to weigh all the options to make the best decision for your community. And a good leader has to be willing to make sacrifices. The Prophet was willing to lose some numbers in order to prioritize the safety of his followers. So the Prophet ﷺ is also, he's a father at the end of the day as well. And he was concerned for his daughter Ruqayya's safety. So one lesson we can learn here is if you want to establish a community with good leadership, find good family men. That is going to be your leader. That's going to be your best leader. Because it's really easy to put on a nice face publicly for an hour or 2 or 3 hours and give a halaqah, give a workshop, give a khutbah, and everybody's like, oh, mashallah, what a great leader. But then when you go home, there's no face you can put on. You are who you are. Your good and your bad is going to come out. So if you have a good family man, then you're also going to have someone who is a good leader. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ said, the best amongst you are the ones who are the best amongst their family, and I am the best to my family. So he's the best of leaders. And all the best of leaders of those after the Prophet ﷺ are those who are the best to their family. So if you, for some reason, desire to become a leader of some sort in the future, even though I feel like you guys have probably heard many of my rants about why that's not something to desire, because there's a lot of responsibility. But if that is something that you do desire, then there's your secret, there's your key, there's your hack, right? Be a quality family man, be a good husband, be a good father. Be a good father, be good to your parents, be good to your siblings, be good to your aunts and your uncles. The reason why Silat al-Rahim, right, is maintaining good ties with your family members is such a rewardable action in our deen is because when it comes to friends, I can remove and add friends based on who treats me well, who doesn't treat me well, who I have fun with, who I don't have fun with. I can just pick and choose whatever I want. But when it comes to family, you don't really get to choose your family. Your aunts will be your aunts, your uncles will be your uncles, your cousins will be your cousins. And so maintaining good ties with them, good relationships with them, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of wisdom, it takes a lot of patience. And that's why it's such a rewardable action. And so again, a good family man, a good family woman, those are the best of leaders in our communities, and those are the ones that we should be seeking out to be our leaders. The Prophet ﷺ also understood the circumstances of Abyssinia at the time, which is there's wisdom behind why he told the Muslims to keep a low profile in Abyssinia. And we'll talk about probably more next week, but this does not mean that the Muslims in Abyssinia didn't do da'wah. Right? That's not what it's not that they didn't do da'wah, but they also needed to be respectful and conduct themselves and not act like this is their own place. Because it's not. You're allowed to do da'wah, but you're not allowed to basically be in people's face and try to establish dominance against them and things like that. And force the deen onto them. I was at the Uplift Da'wah fundraiser yesterday, and one of the verses that we talked about in the Quran is لا إكراه في الدين قد تبين الرشد من الغي. Why is there, and I asked to the Dawah folks, I asked them, I was like, have you guys ever forced anybody to accept Islam? And keep in mind, these guys have converted thousands of people to Islam. Local grassroots organization, right? This is not a paid advertisement, I promise. Right? We don't have that much subscribers on YouTube to be doing paid advertisements. So I asked the Dawah folks, I was like, have you guys ever felt like you needed to force someone to accept Islam? They said, no, of course not. Because لا إكراه في الدين, there's no force from the right. Because why? قد تبين رشد من الغي. The truth stands out from falsehood. It stands out. You don't need to force anybody. You don't need to force anybody. You don't need to push it down anybody's throat. You don't need to conduct yourself in an abrasive manner. So the Prophet ﷺ tells the companions of Abyssinia to keep a low profile, right? Don't be abrasive. And those Muslims also understood that they were the oppressed minority in Mecca, and they should not show up in Abyssinia where they knew they would be safe and then conduct themselves in that way. And so then Surah An-Najm, being revealed, and him reciting it publicly, especially from verse 19 onwards, right? From verse 19 onwards, if you want to go home and read it again or listen to it again, that is what all of Quraysh heard. Before that, he was reciting loudly, but they weren't really hearing what he was saying. And then from verse 19 onwards is what he was, what the whole Quraysh had heard. Also, the migration to Abyssinia is part of the Prophet's strategy to preserve the Muslims in the long run. During the Khilafah of Umar ibn Khattab, the ranks of the Muslims were extremely diverse. There were many Sahaba, there were many Tabi'un, people who became Muslims after the Prophet's death. And the Tabi'un were generally less experienced and younger than the Sahaba. So there's an incident during the Khilafah of Umar al-Khattab where the Muslim soldiers were standing in their lines to fight the Persians. And some were fully armored, and some they had shields, they were armored, and the soldiers in the front lines of the Sahaba was like half and half. Some of them had armor, some of them maybe had armor on their arms and legs, but not on their chest. Some of them had no armor at all. And so one Tabi'i, he sees this huge line of Persians, and the Tabi'un and the Sahaba compared to them are small in number. And he's looking and he's just stunned. This Tabi'i, he's stunned. He's looking and he's like, all I see is steel. All I see is steel. I can't even recognize a face. It's just, right, what do they say? Armor to the teeth, right? And so he says that out loud next to a Sahabi. And the Sahabi replied, and he says, you sound like you accepted Islam recently, right? You sound like you don't have much experience. Y'all know that other meme? First time? Right? So instead of acknowledging, yeah, they're an armor to their teeth, the Sahabi starts motivating the Tabi'in, the Sahaba, right? And he said that we stood by the Prophet in the Battle of Badr and in the Battle of Uhud, where we had been sandwiched. We stood by the Prophet when we dug trenches around Medina. We tied stones to our stomachs to curb the hunger. We stood by the Prophet when thousands of Muslims fled during the Battle of Hunayn and only a few hundred remained to achieve victory for the Muslims. We stood behind the Prophet and made istighfar with him when we conquered Mecca. But you sound new. You sound new to this situation. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he cared more about the preservation and continued spiritual development of the Muslims at this stage. So he exported 90% of the Muslim community and sent them to a safe place in Abyssinia to have that tarbiyah. Because a lot of those Muslims that fled to Abyssinia are going to be the same Muslims that fought in Badr, in Uhud, in Hunayn, in Khandaq, in Tabuk, you name it. So you want to call them cowardly for running away from Mecca to Abyssinia, you're going to have to call them cowardly also for fighting in Badr, Hunayn, Uhud, Khandaq, where they were outnumbered 3 times, 4 times, 10 times, 17 times. You got to be balanced. What's it going to be? Right? But he told them to nurture their iman so that one day they can be strong enough for the day that the Prophet ﷺ needs them by his side. Right? So that's the Prophet ﷺ's philosophy. Right? To protect yourself from the fitna of evil people. قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ. Right? And from the evil of the shayateen and jinn. And there's the evil that is also within people. And so it's in that Madani period of the prophethood when Islam and Muslims become well established, where the Prophet one day was sitting and enjoying the day with Aisha radiallahu anha, and the Prophet ﷺ saw someone coming from a distance, and the Prophet ﷺ told Aisha radiallahu anha to go inside the house, and he says, because that is the worst man of his people. It's trouble walking towards us right now. And Aisha, Aisha radiallahu anha went inside and sat right behind the curtain so she can listen to the 2 men. And when the men came to the Prophet ﷺ, he welcomed them, made small talk with them, exchanged formalities, pleasantries, smiled at them. Then the Prophet ﷺ excused himself and said, I have to take care of some things. After the men left, Aisha radiallahu anha said to the Prophet, what was that? You told me to go inside because he's a troublemaker, but you were so nice to him. You had such a mundane conversation with him. And then he said, I was protecting my people from his evil and harm. I didn't confront him. I didn't call him out. I didn't want to poke the bear and invoke his wrath and evil. Right? So the Prophet ﷺ, he realized that Mecca was irritated. The more visible and prominent Islam was becoming, it was like poking a bear. So by removing the vast majority of Muslims from Mecca and moving them to Abyssinia, the agitation in Mecca is going to slow down several notches. Right? And 2 of the most high-profile conversions to Islam had occurred after that migration of Abyssinia, which will be Hamza radiallahu an and Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu ta'ala an. And we will talk about that inshallah ta'ala either next week or the following week after that. Next week we're going to focus on a conversation that Amr ibn As radiallahu an, he's later going to accept Islam, but at this point he is one of the generals of the Quraysh army, how he is going to travel to Abyssinia and try to save face basically against Najashi and put on a whole PR campaign to try to get the Muslims back into Mecca so they can further their oppression. Wallahu ta'ala alam bis-sawab. Jazakumullahu khairan. Are there any questions? Yeah.
I have one question about you saying the leaders are the ones that's good for your family.
Yeah.
So is that more like for us to be this our family? You mentioned to if you want to hire someone to be a leader, look at how they deal with family. But how do you look at someone how they deal with their family? That's like more internal. If you ask like their brother or sister, no one is gonna sell them out. Like it's kind of no one can tell really.
Yeah. I mean, you do your best. If you hang out with people long enough, their true side kind of comes out. If you see people the way they interact with their family long enough, the true side of it comes out. I'm not saying go do investigations and spy on people. And be like, all right, as part of the interview process, we're going to need you to take us home for a week so we can observe how you treat your family, right? No, that's not what I'm saying. But it's just a general principle, right? And we do our best. وَإِذَا عَزَمْتَ فَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ, right? You do your shura. You do whatever you need to do to seek advice. You call references. You call previous employers. Whatever it is, right? You do your due diligence, and then you make your decision. And then tawakkal ala Allah. Wallahu a'lam. Anybody online? Oh yes, go ahead.
It's a quick question, but I'm just curious what happened to Abu Jahl, because you said he prostrated, which is pretty insane.
Yeah.
I just want to know what he did after. Did you just say black magic?
Yeah, he was one of those that made up the whole PR campaign that this is black magic. So the brother was asking what happened to Abu Jahl afterwards, even though he prostrated as well. Or some of the books of Seerah mentioned that he was also amongst the people that prostrated. He just went back to his old ways. He was part of the campaign that, and that's why I call him the Fir'aun of this ummah, because, even Fir'aun, when you look at the story of Fir'aun, right before, while he's being drowned, right? What did he try to do? He tried to believe in Allah at the very end, right? And then Jibreel, we know the story that Jibreel alayhi salam, stuffed dirt into his mouth, and it was like, nah, you don't, you don't get to get away with the oppression that you caused on this earth. So oppressors, especially those that interact with prophets, they know the truth. They know the truth, right? And, it's also a testament to the adhab that Allah is going to give to these people, that every time we think of oppression, we think of Abu Jahl and Abu Lahab, right? Like, whenever I see acts of aggression that are happening against the ummah, or dhulm that is happening against the ummah, and oppression that is happening against the Muslims, I find myself wanting to recite Surah Al-Lahab over and over again. And it's like, what Surah Al-Lahab is what? It's literally, it's cursing one of the biggest oppressors that the Muslims have ever faced. So, a very unfortunate state to be in, to be living amongst the Prophet ﷺ, see the truth clear as day, and still reject it. And now your name is remembered in history as every single time oppression occurs or injustice occurs, you're the example. What an unfortunate state to be in. And it's also a response to anybody that says, maybe they didn't have the chance, maybe they misunderstood, or anything like that. No. It was clear as day. They saw the miracles, they heard their verses, they even loved the verses. They just couldn't admit it. And so they continued in their injustice. I will make a quick dua inshallah then conclude. Allahumma innaka ta'lamu anna jirahat al-muslimina kathira wa alamun kathira. Allahumma fansurna ala a'da'ina ya Allah. Allahumma thabbit aqdamana ya Allah. ربنا تقبل منا إنك السميع العليم وتب علينا يا مولانا إنك التواب الرحيم واغفر لنا وارحمنا يا مولانا إنك أنت الغفور الرحيم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار اللهم إنا نسألك حبك وحب من يحبك وحب كل عمل يقربنا إلى حبك يا أرحم الراحمين سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته